Okay, so we are 25 in this session today. Welcome again. We are ready now to start our fourth session of the Master Series. So today we will be speaking on when do you know how your stories will end? Now, you know that storytelling is one of the oldest and most profound ways to connect with one another. Yet one of its greatest mystery remains, how do we know when and where our stories should end? I'm sure you've all had one of those books or more than one where you're waiting for the end and that end, end became everything. So today we're going to understand how does a writer shape that journey? Or how do you, in your creative process, actually work on this or work with the end in mind, or how does it all fall in place and things like that. So we're here to hear from an expert. We will have her on board soon and do our introductions. So before we start, let me remind you of the Asian Group of Literature, who hosts this meaningful session for us today. So the Asian Group of Literature includes 6 literary ventures: the Asian Review, the Asian Prizes, the Asian Journal of Literature, and the Asian Literacy Agency, the Asian House of Literature as a whole. So very recently, we've announced the 3 final shortlists of the Asian prizes. So we're waiting to see who the finalists will be. And here we are. So we have with us today Safinah Danish Elahi, who is a lawyer, a poet, and a novelist from Pakistan. She's earned her MFA in Publishing and Contemporary Fiction from Emerson College, Boston, and her poetry collection, The Unbridled Romance of Love and Pain, was labeled epiphanic by the nation's leading newspaper, Dawn. Her debut novel, Eye on the Prize, published in 2020, translated into Urdu, has been converted into a TV series. She is also the founder of an award-winning publishing house, Reverie Publishers. She is an honorary fellow at the University of Iowa and was a resident of the International Writers Program 2022. The Idle Stands of the Tippler Pigeon, her second novel, has been shortlisted for the Asian Fiction Prize 2023. So without further ado, please let me welcome Ms. Safinah Danish Elahi to take over the floor today. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Imali, and thank you to the Asian prizes, the entire group for getting these masterclasses together and sort of giving me the opportunity and the platform to share maybe a few tips that, struggling and established writers also suffer from. So when I was approached for a topic, I found this very interesting because I feel like a lot of people have ideas for a story. When even through our daily life, we find a moment where we think that this could make a great novel, and a lot of people I meet actually who know that I'm a writer, they keep saying that you could write a book on my life, so everyone thinks that there is an interesting story in each person. But how do we show that this story has a beginning, middle, and an end? Because as writers, what we do is that we choose a specific part of somebody's life, and then we relate that to each character in their lives and make it into a compelling story. I think that it's so important to learn the process of writing. So a lot of times what happens is that writers begin writing without actually having a structure in mind. And there are 2 kinds of writers. One, the first kind is a plotter who exactly knows, they'll journal down entries and they'll have a plot and structure and everything, and they'll know how to start their story. They'll know how the character progresses, what's going to happen, and then they know how to end it. But most writers, at least the writers that I've interacted with, are pantsters. Pansters are writers who come up with the story with only an idea, and they don't really know where the story is going, and it's almost like the pen is leading them. So they start writing and they continue writing, and then at some point, they feel like, okay, they're ready to put things together. There's another two kinds of writing. One kind of writer is someone who will have a very thin structure of a novel, and then with an editor's help, they will start developing different scenes in different situations, and they go from like inwards to outwards. And the second kind of novelist or writer is somebody who has a very large chunk of writing, and then they go from outwards to inwards. I have had, I have some experience as a publisher as well, and many people approach me with their stories, and I remember receiving stories that are 150,000 words, which is about 300 or 400 pages worth of novel pages. And to be able to keep the reader in check and keep them interested and invested in the story, it's very important to have the right length of the story as well. So what do? If you have a really long novel, you can't just chop down the end, right? The end has to remain. So a lot of novelists then go outward to inwards. So in my time at my MFA in Emerson, Boston, I did several workshops. I did critiques, and so how workshops work is that you have a sample part of the manuscript, and a lot of your peers will give you feedback on the manuscript, and then you will start to build the story according to their feedback as well. That is very helpful. And some of you who have joined, maybe you're writers and you've worked with editors. And what editors do is also they give structural feedback. They will give you linear, editorial feedback. They'll give you line editing. So they'll put everything together. But how do you know that your story is ready to finish? With my two novels, I'll first share my experience, and then I'll tell you what the industry norm may be or what other writers feel. So with my first story, I began writing. I had a story in mind, and I didn't even know if it was worth publishing, because as a first-time writer, you don't really know if you're writing an interesting story, because you think that something is interesting, but maybe another person looking at the story will be like, okay, I've already read something like this before, why do I need to read your book? So I started writing, and I didn't know how to put it into a novel form. So I reached out to a couple of people I knew, and I asked them, I said, is this an interesting story? They said, yes, it is. I continued writing. I did not know what the end was going to be. And then I reached a point where I said that, okay, I think I want to wrap things up like this. I did a lot of research in terms of, what my characters were going through at that point. And it sort of went in a linear manner that, beginning, middle, and end. And I knew, okay, this is going to be this after everything is wrapped up. There's a scene showing that everyone is sort of happy in their current form. With my second novel, it's interesting that I actually knew the beginning and the end from before. So I knew where my character was going. I did not know how to take my characters to the end. And funnily, I can share that now that it's out in the world and available, worldwide, I can tell that the end written was actually written from another perspective. So I had written the story. I knew that this is going to be the end, but my publisher said that I don't like the end. You need to give it from another perspective. So I actually reworked the end and made it into a more, I think, palatable end. But I mean, the story ended in the same manner that I wanted it to end. It's just that the perspective changed. And I think that it's really ironic. How do you know your story will end? And even with my book, The Idle Stance of the Tippler Pigeon, I've ended it in a really realistic manner. And a lot of readers said that they wanted to know more and they wanted to read a part 2. But the thing is that I felt that this is the story I wanted to tell. I didn't want a very happy ending. I didn't want everything to be perfect in the end. My characters are all happy. I wanted it to be a very realistic ending. And I think in my heart, when I was writing it, I knew that this is the portion of somebody's life that I wanted to tell. And as far as when do you know how to step away from your story? So this is a really critical question, because a lot of times I think us writers, and we're our biggest critiques. I think like I really dislike my work when I read it 2-3 times and I'm just like, oh my God, it has so many flaws. So how do you know that you've edited it enough and this is good enough to be sent out to the world and this is good enough for publishing and printing? I think when you have at least read your own work 20 times and you feel that it is error-free and this is the best version of the book that you could ever make out of it, is when you then take a step back and then you have to let the story do its magic. Because you could be reading it 100 times, you could be editing it, you could be changing it, but there is always a time to end your story. There's always time for closure, and there's always a time to move forward with maybe another story. So I would say that when you feel that you've given it enough and it's error-free and you've taken enough feedback from people you trust and people who have helped you shape the story, then there comes a point where you know that this is the best version of my story. And now I just need to take a step back. I can't keep reworking it. I can't keep reading it. I can't keep editing it. And it will feel complete to you. And then obviously some readers will like it, some readers won't. But that's your best version of the story out in the world. So Imali, maybe we can have some questions that you were talking about.
Sure. Okay, thank you, Safinah, for providing us the ground to start our conversation today and opening us to your own experience of how you choose to decide your end, the end of the book later on. So I think you've already answered our question in terms of shaping and after a process of manuscripts and edits and rounds of reading and reading. But to start our conversation, let me ask you, so can a pre-planned ending evolve, and should it?
Yes, I think that it can definitely evolve and it can definitely shape into completely something that you weren't prepared for. Sometimes while writing a novel, one has to almost imagine themselves in your character's shoes. So once you begin writing, maybe the end that you had imagined is not the end that perfectly suits your story. So definitely I think that stories can evolve, and stories can evolve through good critique and through a good editor as well. They might even tell you, I'll give you an example. So I have a certain reveal in my book, and I had to write that reveal 3 times, because the first time I wrote it and it felt a little bit unnatural. And then I rewrote it and it still wasn't feeling right. And then I remember my editor also suggesting something. She said, do you want to sort of think that it needs to come in even later in the story? So, that's the process that I sort of went through for my novel, that I felt that this is the way I want to write it. But then there were people, editors, and workshop people who kind of suggested that it could even become a better story. So that's how even ends evolve. Sometimes you think that you've ended the story at a certain place, but then you feel like there's something missing, and you continue to sort of understand what your story needs. So it can definitely evolve into something that you had not planned initially.
Okay, I've got yet another question to you on that, but before I ask, I'd like to remind our audience joining today. Good evening, Andrew. Thank you for connecting with us. Well, for everyone who's here, I'd like to remind you, of course, we will speak to Safinah 8:50, about 8:15 our local time, and then we open the session for Q&A. So please line up your questions. We hope to see some interaction for sure. But hold on to it till we finish probing some of our questions while we have her. And you can also drop in your questions on chat and use the audio when we open the floor for that. Right, so just reminding you that. And Safinah, back to us. So I heard your description, or how you describe the editor's role in, when it comes to helping shape the end of it. So do you think it's crucial that the role that an editor plays in terms of defining the end of a book or a story?
I think that a good editor has an eye to make the entire story better. And I think that also a good editor is someone who will respect the writer's wishes as well. So a lot of times, not with me, I think I've been very fortunate with really, really great editors. But a lot of times I've heard very, horror stories in terms of how the editor tried to change everything in a story. So, like, it's very important to keep the writer's voice authentic as well. Because if you edit it so much that it turns into something else, that then doesn't work, because then the editor should write the book, right? So definitely I feel like good editors will definitely improve your story. They will give good feedback, they will give good critique, they will tell you that, okay, this is not working, you need to fix this, or this part of the book needs more explanation, less, emotion, less words, even more, more feeling, less telling. Like, they will tell you that what portion of the book needs or requires more work. But at the same time, I think it is the writer's sort of right to refuse any kind of suggestion that they think that doesn't work for the novel. So obviously the writer has, an idea of how they want to take the story from beginning to end. And changing too much of it would also be unfair, I think, to the integrity of the writing. But I think that a good editor and writer relationship has to have some boundaries, and at the same time, it has to be respected mutually. Like, as a writer, I have to respect my editor, that he or she knows what they're talking about. They know the commercial angle of books. And me as a creative will only be like, okay, this story makes sense to me. But the editors sometimes, especially if they're provided by the publisher, they will know that, okay, the market, requires you to write this in a certain way. And I actually have an example from my book as well, that I had a character which was a white character, and he was friends with a Pakistani boy. And the editor suggested that make this into sort of a Pakistani, the two boys, expats from Pakistan, make it into that friendship, because the readers will relate to it more that way. And it was a very minor character. It didn't change much of the story. Like, the character shows up in maybe 2 chapters of the story. But I found it really useful because, the editor was coming from a place of knowledge, and she knew that readers will associate to this friendship more than the friendship that I had created. So it was the same character, just a few little, changes in the story. And yeah, I mean, I think that it was quite insightful that she was able to pinpoint how to make the friendship better.
Okay, great to know that, Safinah. So I think it's altogether a different conversation around selecting the right editor. How does that guidance process work? But coming back to our key topic today around how does the end, or how do you determine the end of a story? My next question to Safinah on that is, so how does knowing or not knowing the ending affect the writing process?
So if you know the end, it's really good for you. It's really good for the writer, because then you have a roadmap how to reach the end. So it's almost like when you're writing, you have a blindfold. So if you know that your book is leading you somewhere, it's still helpful to keep going forward. With a blindfold, if you don't know where it's going, then you will be going in every direction. So it's really difficult to walk a path when you don't even know where you're going. So it's very helpful, but not all writers and not all stories begin with an end in mind. So a lot of times, and a lot of writers come up with a story and they don't know where the story will go, and it's almost like they stumble upon the ending. How do you know that this is what the reader will be satisfied with? How do you know that this is going to or not? Because this I chose as the perfect end to my story. If somebody else was writing this story, maybe they would have ended it earlier, or they would have added more an extra scene to it, or would have led the character somewhere else. But because this is my story, I chose to end it in a manner that worked best in terms of how I thought up the story. So for me, that ending made most sense. Even if some people might expect that, we wanted to know more, we wanted it to be, chalked out or lengthened, or, we wanted to know every aspect of the end. But I think that as a writer, one has to make a call on when you think is the right time to finish the story and leave the reader with some thoughts, so they can sort of think about what they just read, and maybe those questions will help them process the story better.
Then you find a way to production budget and
So I think I've hear some keywords like writer's integrity, or writing to feed the curiosity of the reader. A couple of times, but we'll wait to see how that summarizes for us in the end. My final question to you, Safinah, is how do endings shape the reader's experience and the legacy of a story? So I think this connects to what I suggested as keywords as well. So how do you think, putting it together, how do you think that feeds a curiosity and shape the reader's experience and the legacy of a story? Yeah.
I think, Imali, that a good book asks the right questions. From the start of the story, why are we telling that story? Why do we decide that this book is needed in the world? There are so many stories that are already there. Why is my story important? And somebody, once I was doing a session, someone said to me that, there are no new stories. There are only new ways to tell them. So it's so important that the way you're telling your story is igniting that curiosity in the reader. Things that maybe the reader hasn't noticed before in their relationships, in their situations, in their daily life. Reading that story stirs up that curiosity for them. And that relates to the ending as well. So once they have gone through a journey with you, with your characters, they will feel the need to question their own life, question situations in their own life. And I think that's what maybe a good writer can do, that they don't handhold, they don't tell the reader to think this. It's sort of taken in an open way, and there is the reader's lived experience will make them question things accordingly. And then finally, it's like the end is like a tied ribbon. The end has to stir up some really, great questions and curiosity in the reader, thinking that, okay, what did I just read? What happened in the story? So if it's the end is completely left, like unanswered, that might also give a feeling of like restlessness in the reader. So there has to be some kind of, you know, closure, I would say, or satisfaction when one goes through the text and doesn't think that, oh my God, what did I just read, you know? So it has to be some kind of explanation, but not too much. Because if the writer tries to explain the story or explain the end too much, then it's spoon feeding. Then it's like, okay, reader, I want you to think this in the end. See, this is how I wanted the story to end. And this is the only way that the story should have ended. I like, you know, endings that are complete, but at least can be interpreted in a different manner by a different reader. So, you know, not completely answered, but not left completely hanging either. You know, not that it's abrupt, it's complete, but it doesn't really answer all your questions.
Okay, so now that brings in curiosity, Safinah. Is there a special reason for that? I mean, you know, to put some context in, I think we've read books where we need at least known a good deal of the end, right? We know what this would end like.
Yeah.
We've also read stories where we are left a little clueless. Okay, what happened to the main characters? And sometimes you might want to go back in the pages and see where did I miss the clues, right? Then there are those books that ends with impact, makes you think a long time after you read the book, you still want to think about it. So, Safinah, how you know, put together with what you mentioned, that you said you don't want to add in too much, you know, leave them hanging, or you don't want to give it very neat and straightforward either. How do you play in between these two? How do you choose the balance?
I think that's a great question. I think that balance, any writer who has gone through the journey of writing a novel, they will know. You know, they will know that I don't want my reader to know exactly word by word what is happening. You know, maybe they'll want to reread the ending. And maybe the second time they read it, it's going to give them a different feeling. You know? So, and it's not about confusing the reader. I mean, not at all. I don't think, like, as a reader also, if I've ever read a book or watched a movie which has been just completely confusing, that is actually irritating. You know, like if you're watching something or reading something and it just ends without any sort of, you know, warning or explanation, I find that very irritating. But sometimes the story is gradually ending and you know it's ending, but it doesn't wrap up like a fairy tale. You know, like it's not a happily ever after. That is the kind of story that I usually write, because I don't want my reader to think that, okay, this character had 4 problems and all 4 problems have been solved by the end of the story. Because that's not how even my fictional life works, you know. I feel like I take a chunk of somebody's life and not every problem is solved in that life. You know, it's still kind of an ongoing journey for each character. But I have decided to stop telling this story, you know. So when you read the story, you will know what I'm trying to do. You know, you will know that, okay, this is not an abrupt end, but it's also not, you know, completely tied together, like, okay, now everything is okay. So I think that balance is important. Just making sure that you're not confusing the reader, you're satisfying them to an extent, but also keeping them slightly curious.
Okay, great. So I think it's a little bit of the hook also, no? You don't give too much, so
Yeah,
you give them just little to entice them, to keep them going for the. All right. So I think I have just about a little time, so I can move into another, you know, last question to ask. But I think with this topic around, we've got so much to, but let me choose this one.
Yeah.
So right. How much do your characters influence the outcome of your story? And do they ever rewrite your intended ending? So this is when you start your writing, your creative process, you know, whether you start with the end in mind or whatever, and then you decide to, you know, while you write it, had there ever been instances where your characters define the end in a different
Yes, actually that is true. Sometimes you begin writing a character and it's almost like the characters are guiding you. You know, when you have a certain end in mind and when you start writing the end, you think that, but this character will not put up with this. You know, this is not the way her story will end. And it's almost like you had this story in your mind, but the character now is driving a change in your story because you're now so invested in what the character holds, what value the character holds, that now the character feels like a separate entity, you know, and the way you were going to end the story does not make sense anymore. So you end up, and that's what actually happened with my next novel. The one, it's not out yet, but I wrote the entire story, and towards the end, I decided to sort of divide that in parts. And I did a part 1, part 2, part 3, and part 4. And the story ended at part 3. And then there's the protagonist. I felt like she's unable to communicate with the reader. So a part 4 I wrote just for her. You know, she is directly talking to the reader. And that's a lot of people who read the first draft and the second draft, they think it's very bold, and this doesn't happen, it's against all formatting and structure of a novel, and you shouldn't do that, you shouldn't change perspectives. And I felt that my character drove that story. My character drove that ending. The story had already ended, but it was almost like my character Areen, she wanted to speak to the reader. So she was the character that drove the end in a way that is written right now. So very interesting that you asked me this, because with the other 2 novels, that didn't happen. It usually, like, I was invested and I knew what's happening. But with this book, I felt that the ending wasn't enough. I wanted the reader to interact with the character, with the protagonist. So yeah, it just became a different story towards the end.
Okay, great, Safinah, for sharing yet another example from your own works, and also sharing. We've got something to wait for as your 3rd book is coming. It would be great at some point if you can also introduce us to the 2 books that you already have done.
Yeah.
But while we wait to see that, let me also open the floor for questions and answers from now on. And let me remind you, it would be easy if you raise your hand, so we know to speak to you in a particular order, or please drop in your QAs on the chat as well. And before you start your Q&A, everyone, we'd also like to have a little bit of interaction in our session today. So I've got a slide for you on that, and I've got a question for you, because you've been a very patient audience out there. So I'll also put my question on chat as well as project it on the slide. So could I ask for, let me check words. Yes, just a moment. So this is I'll drop you the question right away. It's actually a very personal question, and I know each of us has a different title for this. So we'd like to ask you to mention a title of the story with the most impactful ending for you, right? So I'm sure we have authors here, we have readers, and definitely enthusiastic readers, and that's why you've just chosen to spend almost 50 minutes with us on a Saturday evening. So we'd like to hear from you, audience, and to Safinah, open to you as well. Please feel free to share with us a title, a story that you found impactful.
So I think I can just talk about two recent books that I've read that made a great impact. The first is actually by a Sri Lankan writer. It's called The Brotherless Night. And it's a very intense story about a girl who is, you know, in the US, but she kind of looks back on her life in Sri Lanka. And I think that, you know, the entire story was very impactful. But at the same time, I think the end was also very, very impactful because I didn't expect. So she starts with a prologue, like a preface, you know, to the story. And it's just one page. So it kind of teases the reader that, okay, this has happened, she's in the US, but we don't know what's happening now. Like, who is she meeting? And only the end, you know, in the end you find and it's revealed who the person she was, going to meet. So during the story, it feels like it's a love interest. But I mean, I can't spoil the story for anyone who's joined this meeting. So it's actually like a surprise towards the end. So I thought that it was very impactful, and I thought it was done very intelligently as well, because throughout the story it kept, the story kept nudging me towards the beginning, that okay, she's going to meet someone. Who is it? So I thought that was very impactful to reveal it towards the end. And a second book that I just read is called My Friends by Hisham Matar. That has also been longlisted for the Booker Prize. And again, very emotional, very beautiful writing. And the story is very impactful as well. It's about a friendship between two men. And they have a connection, from their home country, and they're living in the UK. So that book also had a very great impact ending that I felt.
Right. Okay, thank you for sharing that, Safinah. So that's great to hear of a Sri Lankan author. I think Brothers Night. This is by V.V. Ganeshanathan.
Yeah.
Okay. I think they, matter of coincidence that they somehow have some sort of similar themes as well, I guess, by the sound of it. It's about connection. All right, so we have the first question coming in, but at the same time, I'd like to remind you, audience, we'd like to see some titles on the chat in response to our question. So feel free to share.
What about you? Do you have a title that has impacted you and the ending has impacted you greatly?
Well, yes. Okay, so I think a couple of books, Safinah. So one is by Kiran Desai. And another is The Alchemist. It's one of these books that I read literally every year, and then it resonated with me when you said, books can mean differently, right? When you read them over years, your own life experience, your maturity, and you understand the end also differently, right? So I do have a habit of reading it. Yes, couple of books, but those stand out as the ones that that I could say out now.
For sure.
Right. So I'm waiting to see some answers, audience. We'd like to hear from you. And then please over to you, H. Lim. I hope I got your name right. Please feel free to mention it as you start your question. Over to you. We don't hear you yet if you're speaking. All right, so we have.
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity, and thank you, our speaker, for the great insight. My name is Paige. I live in Uganda as a refugee. So then I would also like to ask about storytelling, because I you know, refugees has gone through several stories. You know, such people who live in the camp, sometimes they have a lot of stories that when they put in books can really be something great that can change lives. So now then, you know, like among the youth in most settlements, so sometimes they have that habit of, they see storytelling as something that is really, that cannot do something great. So they don't have that interest, or so they don't have that interest to write books, or because maybe sometimes because they don't have the knowledge. So in such situation, what can we do as maybe those who fight harder to empower the communities? What can we do in order for them to have that spirit of writing books? They can, yeah. So what I would like to know, then if there are steps that someone can follow in order to be a writer, for example, like how you started as a writer, maybe you may not start as perfect, but at certain point, you became perfect. So what step did you take maybe so that we can also say the same stories to young people in order for them also to fall, so that they can be writers like our speaker. Yeah, so that's what I'm asking. I don't know if you get the question well.
I did. Thank you for that
Yeah.
question. Thank you. So I feel like, you know, you just mentioned that they're great stories. They're great stories all around us. And I think it's very important to capture those stories as well. A lot of times, and storytelling is the oldest sort of art and communication form. You know, from very early on, people communicated with other people through stories. So if you have people in, you know, living with you who have some great stories, it's a really great idea to start journaling them, to start writing a story, because, you know, sometimes you have an idea, but how do you sort of communicate that in a way that other people will also understand it? You know, for example, like when your day is starting, it seems like you're just going through the motions of a day. You know, you're cooking food and you're working during the day, and you're, you know, picking up your child from somewhere, you're feeding them, you're eating. So there's many things that are happening in a day, right? But how can you tell a story over a year, or over 5 years, or over 10 years, or over a person's lifetime? You know, how do you sort of condense those events and try to figure out what information is important enough to tell? You know, so when you say that it's a great story, which parts are great? You know, which parts are important, and which parts can you tie together for them to make sense to someone who doesn't know about you, who doesn't know your story? So even children, you know, we encourage them to start sort of imagining things in a way, and start writing pointers first. Start to tell your story by sort of knowing where your story is going. It has to, like, you know, the topic is also, how does your story end? But your story can only end when it has a beginning and a middle. You know, so great stories are out there. You just need to know how to form them. I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
Okay, so great. I think we will have a writer coming up, Pesh, for asking the sequence of writing a book. Right. So we have 33 in our session today, and it can't be this silent. I don't think writers only write. I'm sure writers do speak as well. So please, this is your opportunity, your time to hear from Safinah. Not just about how stories will end for sure, but just like Pesh, if you got a question that you really wanted to have the answer for, then I think it's your chance now. In the meantime, Safinah, while we wait, do you have a copy of your book with you that you can share with us, or let me also put it in the chat?
Let me see if I have a copy here. Let me just give me 1 minute.
All right.
So this is the first novel. It's called Eye on the Prize. And this story is about three sort of third graders, three children, about the age of 9 years old. And they basically are competing at a sports day in school. And, what I wanted to tell with this story was that they're competing at a sports day. So all the parents are very interested in their child winning. And they're really pumping them up and they're saying, oh, you must win the race, you must win the race. But then there are children who don't win, and they actually don't even care about winning at that age. It's the parents putting the pressure on the children to win something. There's obviously healthy competition, but I sort of talk about it as a social and cultural perspective on parenting and on healthy competition and how parents can support their children's mental health. So this story revolves around three families, those three children and their families. And this is the book that has been shortlisted, The Idle Stance of the Tippler Pigeon. This story is about a brother and a sister and their house help. So a lot of times in South Asia, the people from a higher income class, they hire people to work for them in their homes. So we call them, our help, nanny, maid. And this brother and sister's parents bring someone in who is called Masi, and she brings in her daughter as well. So these three sort of, two girls and a boy, they become friends. And they don't really care that their nanny's daughter is, from a different income group. So they become best friends and they do many things together. And I tried to show it from a lens of an economic and social class difference. And then we see, how that girl who grows up is treated in different workplaces. And then I feel like, this is sort of like a commentary of what goes on when you pluck somebody out of a certain class and then you give them a better life, you give them education. And, even when the children are friends, the adults still know that she's the nanny's daughter. So I tried to show little, nuances with my writing, that how do we treat it differently? How is that child treated differently? So this is what The Idle Stance of the Tippler Pigeon is about.
All right. So thank you for taking the time to share your books. The latter, I think, also mentioned by Safinah, is a short list of the Asian Prize for Literature. We have two questions, I believe, questions or comments yet to hear. So Felix, over to you, and then to you, Novi.
Hello. Thank you, Mali and Safinah, for the opportunity. My name is Felix Egon from the floor of the Rift Valley in a city called Nakuru in Kenya. I've found a lot of inspiration in the work you do. Thank you for taking your time to give us the opportunity to get to learn how a young man from the floor of the Rift Valley on the eastern side of Africa can be able to get out there and give out their message. In a question, how do you think the new technological advances or affordances are affecting your writing? Because as you can notice, we're able to do self-publishing, and it has actually changed a lot of dynamics. And also in the process of you writing, do you get to consult your potential readers from time to time, or you get responses after you're done with the writing? Thank you for the opportunity. Looking forward to hearing more from you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for that question, Felix. Yes, I think that with recent, AI and technology and ChatGPT, a lot of people think that writing will become obsolete. I personally don't think so. I think that writing is a creative art form, and with how the human mind works, we create new things. We create new ways of creating a story. So with ChatGPT, if you write, that write a story for me like Harry Potter in Sri Lanka or in Kenya, it will write that story for you. But it will write a story like Harry Potter, not something new. So when Harry Potter was written, nobody knew Harry Potter. Nobody knew that this could be a worldwide phenomenon. So I feel like AI and technology definitely makes things easier to sort of broadcast, easier to research. But I do feel like stories will never go obsolete, because the underlying art of any entertainment or any art form is storytelling. Even TV requires storytelling. Even a good advertisement requires storytelling. So yes, we can use technology to better our storytelling, to better our research, but I don't think it can take over what a writer's job and what a writer's creativity can contribute to the world. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for your question.
Great questions. We have Novil next and Tamarasi. We also have a question on chat. We'll come to that once we've heard from this. Novil, over to you, please.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect.
Thank you so much for that inspirational session, Safinah. And just a question, like, I'm not a writer, but I'm just thinking of taking up some small writings just for fun. But I'm just trying to see, the world is very complex, and we have very challenging things happening around us. So when we write, what about taking a particular side? Or should we be very unbiased and, very kind of, should we keep our biases, or, how should we move about it? Just trying to figure out, navigate some areas to concentrate on. Thank you.
That's an excellent question. And it's really funny because I actually had a debate and wrote a paper on it. In my time in Iowa, I was at a residency, the Iowa Writers Program, International Writers Program. And somebody asked me this. They said that, what if you are the oppressor's voice in a story? How do you justify that? And that made me really think, that what if you're writing a story about a serial killer? How do you justify their killing? How do you humanize this person who is doing such bad things? And the same goes for, the world being complicated, and there are so many oppressors in this world. So as a writer, I think that it's a personal preference. I mean, I think that there is definitely a writer's bias, and the way the writer will write a character will also be a preference. It will be a personal choice in how they want to deal with an issue. For example, they could be preaching. They could be saying this is wrong, don't do this. And the character in the story is telling the reader not to do it. But then sometimes there's a way to challenge the reader. And the writer knows that this is the oppressor and he's doing a bad thing. And the reader knows that this is the oppressor and he's doing the bad thing. But there is no telling. You set the stage in your writing in a way that the reader is able to understand what the writer is saying and approaching the issue in a very neutral, way, and then coming to a conclusion that, yes, this should not be done. You know, so there's like a very complicated way and an art to deliver something like this, especially if you are planning to choose a side, which is not the oppressor's side, right? But it has to be done with a lot of finesse and a lot of sort of an open dialogue within the story. If there's too much telling and too much preaching, then it's not creative writing, you know, then it's somebody telling you to hold certain opinions. So you have to respect the reader's intellect as well, and kind of, I think, make their own decision regarding how they feel about this particular issue. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that
Appreciate it.
question. Thank you.
Tamarasi next.
Hi, I would like to first tell the one of the two stories that had the two impactful endings. One is Eva Ebbotson's One Dog and a Boy, and also The Last Bear by Hannah Gold. Both are in the sort of children's literature format. So those are two endings that had impactful endings for me. As far as the question is concerned, my question is, when you're writing a story and when you go ahead, sometimes when you're in the middle of the story also, the ending that you had in your mind can change. And towards the end, you might be in a position where you have two or more or multiple endings, which you think are equally interesting and compelling. So in such a situation as a writer, how do you like pick one direction?
It's like choosing which one of your children do you like better.
Yeah.
So I feel like, you know, because you're the one who has sort of created those two endings, it will have to be instinct. You know, it generally has to be instinctive that you feel one ending is making more sense to you. And then there are editors who help you reach that decision, right? So what happens is that, like, maybe you think that one ending is working better, but commercially your editor thinks that, and that's sort of very helpful when somebody else tells you. And then, you know, they have like not just one editor. There's your publisher, and then there's like 2 or 3 people who are sort of forming a committee and then coming up with a conclusion. So if there are a couple of endings, then yes, like they will help you, they will tell you that this might work better. And if I feel very strongly about one ending, then I might be able to convince them. But if I'm also like kind of 50-50, then I'll go with what they're suggesting as readers of the text.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Okay, so in the meantime, Tamarasi, I've also captured books that you mentioned, so I'm just putting it out there on the list. So, you know, if there's anybody else who'd like to find them, read it. I think we're talking about books, so I guess it's good to hear as many books. So I'm putting that out there as well. We do have a question from Elamiga. I hope I got your name right. So he says he does entrepreneurial trainings. And how can I get to write stories for those who have impressed the skills for production? Elamiga, would you like to elaborate your question on audio?
Yes, good evening, everyone.
Yes, good evening.
I do entrepreneurship trainings to startups, and there are so many startups who have successfully impressed on the knowledge, and now you find they have managed to start up their different activities. But there are other people who have not taken the initiative to impress on this these skills well. So I'm looking at using a story of one successful person, how he started and how he's able to come up and he was able to start to impress the skills, so that other people who will read this story and then also feel that, if that is the case, why can't I also be able to impress on this? Maybe my situation could have been much better than the situation of other people. So using that scenarios, how would I be able to come up with this? And how would I be able to identify that I can best identify a better story writer from what levels? That's what I wanted to see if I can picture one or two, so that I see how to tap on them for the purpose of starting it up.
Yes, I think what you're referring to is maybe motivational stories. So a lot of stories written by a lot of writers all over the world, I think can be very motivational. And I don't know any particular stories about, particularly what you're looking for the production process. But I think anyone with a good motivational story, sort of like rags to riches, somebody who had so much drive that they came out on the top and they were able to sort of, start something that they didn't know how to finish. I think any kind of motivational story can work better, and it would motivate your, your workers and people to start new things and believe in themselves and have faith in the kind of work they do. So I think any kind of motivational story, whether it's fictional or even, sometimes you read memoirs and biographies of successful people, I think that might be a good idea as well, because they usually are the ones who have like this, fantastic idea, and then they kind of end up changing the world with it. So I think that's a good place to start from.
Okay, Almiga, I hope that answered your question. So any further questions, or do you think it's about time?
Yeah, I think it's been an hour.
Okay, so I think we've heard about stories, we've heard about Safinah's written her own experience, other books, sharing so many things tonight. I've also, playing back some of the keywords, I think writer's integrity, and I really like something that came out, I think, towards the end of end of the question too, where you said, writers know that where to feel the story. You just feel it. So I guess listen to your own heart, or listen to your own conscience, or however you'd like to call it. The answer might be there. So thank you very much, Safinah, for sharing this time with us. It's so special to have you on our 4th session today, and to hear from you about process of writing, how you determine the end, and all those ideas that you filled us with. And the audience, thank you so much for your engagement, and for sharing your own experiences. I think we have a diverse audience, so we're bringing different perspectives in today. So yeah, now the next thing is about, how do you shape that legacy? How do you give it some form? I'd like to leave you all with one question. What do you want your ending to leave behind? So I think that is something for you to think over. And tonight we thank Safinah once again for joining with us. And thank you all for being such an interactive audience. And thank you, Asian Review. We'll meet again another time.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.